The auctioneer's voice is a blunt instrument, hammering the thick, dusty air of Redemption Gulch. It carves through the murmurs of the crowd, a mix of pious satisfaction and morbid curiosity. On the raised platform in the town square, beneath the unforgiving July sun, stands a woman's writing desk. It's a handsome piece of cherry wood, elegant and out of place, its polished surface filmed with grime. Next to it, looking smaller than she is, stands the woman herself. Her name is Alara Vance. She is, or was, the town's teacher. Now, she is its spectacle. Her hands are clasped over the subtle but undeniable swell of her belly, a protective gesture that only serves to highlight her crime. Her face is pale, her eyes fixed on a loose floorboard, refusing to meet the dozens of gazes dissecting her. They are stripping her of her dignity, piece by piece. First her job, then her meager lodgings, and now this. We have the desk, the auctioneer, a portly man named Silas Croft, who also happened to be the mayor, booms with false bonhomie. A fine piece for any home. But that ain't all we're auctioning today, folks. Under the town's moral indenture clause, we are also auctioning the labor contract for one Miss Alara Vance, for a term of 1 year, to pay her debt to this community for her transgression. A cruel titter runs through the crowd. Debt. The word hangs in the air, heavy and foul. Her transgression was falling in love with a traveling surveyor who had promised her marriage and left her with nothing but a child growing within her and a town turning its back. The winning bidder gets the desk. Croft continues, and the services of this woman. Good for mending, cleaning, light farm work, whatever you see fit. All for the price of her keep and $1 paid to the town coffers for the trouble she's caused. A bargain for a strong back, even if it comes with a weak will. Silence. This isn't about labor. It's about punishment. It's about making an example of her. Alara feels a tear escape and trace a hot path through the dust on her cheek. This is it. This is the end of her life. She will be handed over to some grim-faced farmer's wife who will work her to the bone out of spite, or worse, to a man who will see her as property in every sense of the word. Her freedom, her future, her child's future, all of it being sold along with her desk. On the edge of the crowd, leaning against the awning of the general store, a man watches. He is not of this town. His name is Chayton, and he is a Lakota horse trader. His presence is a quiet defiance in itself. His dark hair is long, braided with a single hawk feather. His face is weathered, carved by sun and wind into planes of stoic calm, but his eyes miss nothing. They are dark and intelligent, moving from the sneering face of the mayor to the trembling figure of the teacher. He'd ridden in to trade a string of fine ponies and had walked into a den of wolves parading as sheep. He understands the language of power and value better than anyone here. He knows the worth of a good horse, the weight of a man's word, and the hollow ring of hypocrisy. He sees them selling not just a woman, but an idea, the idea that they have the right to break someone for being human. Do I have a bid to start us off? Croft asks, scanning the faces. $1 is all it takes to own your own redemption project. A farmer named Griggs, known for his sour disposition and heavy hand, raises a grubby finger. $1. Alara flinches, a barely perceptible tremor. She knows Griggs. His farm is isolated, his wife long dead. A cold dread, sharper than any she has yet felt, seeps into her bones. $1 it is. Croft grins. Going once. It is then that a new voice cuts through the air. It is not loud, but it has the kind of carrying power that makes every head turn. I will take her. The words are simple, direct. Chayton pushes himself off the wall and takes a step forward. The crowd parts for him, a mixture of fear and disdain on their faces. He ignores them, his gaze fixed on Mayor Croft. Croft's grin falters. What was that, boy? Chayton's expression doesn't change. He reaches into a leather pouch at his hip and pulls out a coin. It's not $1. It's a $20 gold piece. He flips it in the air. It catches the sun, a brief, dazzling flash, before he plucks it from its arc. He looks directly at Croft, then lets his gaze sweep over the crowd, his eyes lingering for a moment on the shocked face of Alara Vance. He is a man who deals in livestock, who understands a good trade. And he has just seen the most undervalued soul he has ever laid eyes on. With a quiet, unassailable confidence that silences the entire square, he lays out his terms, not as a plea, but as a declaration. "I will pay $20, he says, his voice as calm and steady as a deep river. "For the desk. The labor contract is included, as you said, and for your silence. All of it." He has seen their greed and their prejudice, and he knows exactly which one to appeal to. He is not just bidding, he is outsmarting them. He is turning their cruel transaction into a simple, profitable sale they'd be fools to refuse, and in doing so, he is buying her freedom. They faced harsh judgment, but someone saw their true value. Before this story unfolds, tell us, have you ever stood up for someone unfairly judged? If you believe in looking beyond the surface, hit like and subscribe. The gold coin lay in Chayton's palm, a sun in miniature, radiating a power that had nothing to do with its monetary value. It was a challenge, a rebuke, and a perfectly calculated move. Mayor Croft's eyes, which had been alight with sanctimonious fire, now glittered with a more primal, familiar gleam: avarice. $20 was a fortune. It was more than the town's monthly budget for road repairs. It was an amount that transformed a moral spectacle into a business transaction, and business was something Silas Croft understood far better than morality. He licked his lips, his gaze darting from the coin to Chayton's unreadable face. The indenture clause was a flimsy, archaic piece of town charter law, resurrected specifically for this occasion. Its purpose was humiliation, not profit. But $20 could be explained to the town council as a civic windfall. "The bid is $20, Croft announced, his voice suddenly stripped of its theatrical boom and replaced with the clipped tone of a merchant closing a deal. He looked at Griggs, who spat a wad of tobacco juice into the dust, and shook his head, his face a mask of sullen resentment. No one else dared to counter. To bid against the Indian would be one thing. To bid against that much gold would be lunacy. "So," Croft declared, slamming an imaginary gavel with his hand, "to the gentleman, for $20. The desk and the contract are yours." A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. Disappointment, confusion, a grudging respect for the sheer audacity of the play. They had come for a sermon and a shaming. They had gotten a horse trade. Chayton walked forward. He didn't look at Alara. He walked straight to the mayor and dropped the coin into his fleshy, outstretched palm. Croft's fingers closed around it like a trap. "The receipt," Chayton said, his voice low and firm. Croft, flustered, tore a piece of paper from a notepad in his coat pocket and scribbled hastily. "Received $20 for one desk and one labor contract, term of 1 year. Paid in full." He signed it with a flourish and handed it over. Chayton took the paper, folded it precisely, and tucked it inside his shirt. Only then did he turn his attention to the platform. He approached the cherrywood desk first. He ran a hand over its surface, not with the possessiveness of an owner, but with the appraising touch of a man who respected craftsmanship. Then his eyes finally met Alara's. She stood frozen, a statue carved from fear and disbelief. Her mind was a whirlwind. Who was this man? Why had he done this? The jump from the cruel familiarity of Griggs to this complete unknown was dizzying. He was an outsider, a man viewed with suspicion and contempt by the very people who had just condemned her. Had she just been sold from one cage into another, albeit a more expensive one? His eyes held none of the leering triumph she had dreaded. They were quiet, deep, and unervingly calm. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod towards the steps leading off the platform. It wasn't a command, it was an invitation. A silent, "It is over. Let's go." Numbly, she moved. Her legs felt like lead, but they obeyed. As she descended the steps, a path cleared before her. The townspeople stared, their faces a mixture of thwarted righteousness and raw curiosity. She kept her eyes down, focusing on the scuffed toes of her boots, feeling the heat of their judgment like a physical brand. Chayton didn't speak. He walked over to where 2 stout men were already moving to claim the desk. "Leave it," he said. The men looked to the mayor. who gave a curt nod. "It's his. He paid for it." Chayton turned and gestured toward the far end of the street, where a sturdy wagon was hitched, loaded with supplies, and tethered behind a string of 4 magnificent horses. They were lean, powerful animals, their coats shimmering in the sun, a testament to his trade. The walk was the longest of Alara's life. Every footstep echoed in the ringing silence. He walked beside her, not touching her, but maintaining a proximity that felt less like a guard and more like a shield. When they reached his wagon, he untied the reins of a gentle-looking mare. "Can you ride?" he asked. It was the first full sentence he had directed at her. His voice was low, resonant, with an accent that was not of this town or any she knew. She swallowed, her throat dry as dust. "Yes." He nodded, then turned his attention to arranging a thick blanket over the mare's back, securing it with a single. He offered her his clasped hands as a step. For a moment, she hesitated, her ingrained fear of men, of dependency, warring with the sheer exhaustion that threatened to pull her to the ground. His hands were steady, his gaze patient. She placed her worn boot into his palm and allowed him to lift her onto the horse's back. The movement was smooth, effortless. He then swung himself onto his own mount, a powerful black stallion that shifted restlessly beneath him. Without a backward glance at the town of Redemption Gulch, he clicked his tongue and led the string of horses forward, Alara's mare falling into line behind him. They rode out of town, leaving the whispers and the judgment behind them. The oppressive heat of the square gave way to the arid breeze of the open plains. The landscape stretched out, vast and indifferent, a world of muted greens and browns under a pale, endless sky. The silence between them was as wide as the horizon. Alara didn't know where she was going. She didn't know the name of the man who had bought her. She only knew the rhythmic sway of the horse beneath her and the sight of his straight back as he led her away from the only world she knew, into an unknown that was both terrifying and, for the first time in months, held a tiny, flickering spark of something that wasn't despair. The journey was silent, measured by the rhythmic clop of hooves on the dry earth. Chayton set a slow, steady pace, mindful of her condition, though he never mentioned it. They traveled for what felt like hours, the sun sliding down the western sky, painting the clouds in shades of bruised purple and fiery orange. The oppressive buildings of Redemption Gulch shrank to a smudge on the horizon and then disappeared altogether. Alara felt a knot in her chest begin to loosen with every mile that separated her from that town square. They left the open plain and entered a region of rolling hills and sparse, hardy pine. The air grew cooler, scented with dust and pine needles. Finally, as twilight began to bleed the color from the landscape, Chayton led them into a shallow, secluded coulee. It was a natural sanctuary, sheltered from the wind. A small, clear creek trickled through its center, and a grove of cottonwoods rustled their silver-backed leaves in the evening breeze. His camp was simple, meticulously organized. A small canvas tent was pitched near the creek. A fire pit, ringed with stones, held the gray ashes of a previous fire. His supplies were neatly stacked and covered with a tarp. It was the camp of a man who lived a life of deliberate solitude, a man at home in the wilderness. There was no sign of another living soul. He dismounted in a single fluid motion and came to her horse. He didn't offer his hands this time, but simply stood by the mare's head, giving her the space to dismount on her own. Alara slid down, her body aching from the ride and the tension of the day. Her feet had barely touched the ground when a wave of dizziness washed over her. She stumbled, putting a hand out to the horse's flank to steady herself. Immediately, Chayton was there. He didn't grab her, but his arm was a solid presence beside her, a wall she could lean against if she needed to. "Sit," he said, his voice gentle but firm. He guided her to a smooth, flat rock near the fire pit. She sank onto it, the exhaustion of the last few weeks crashing down on her all at once. She watched, her limbs too heavy to move, as he worked with an efficient grace. He unsaddled the horses, rubbed them down, and led them to the creek to drink before hobbling them in a grassy patch. He moved without wasted motion, a man in complete harmony with his environment and his tasks. He returned to the fire pit and, with a skill born of long practice, had a small, bright fire crackling in minutes. He filled a pot with water from the creek and set it on a grate over the flames. He didn't speak to her, didn't ask her questions. He simply moved about his chores, granting her the mercy of his silence. It was a profound relief. She didn't have the words to explain her situation, nor the strength to endure interrogation. After a while, he brought her a tin cup of hot, sweet tea. Her hands trembled as she took it. The warmth seeped into her fingers, a small comfort in the vast, intimidating wilderness. "Thank you," she whispered. The words felt inadequate, flimsy. He gave a slight nod and went back to the fire, where he was slicing jerky and dried apples into a skillet. The smell of the food cooking made Alara realize she was ravenous. She hadn't been able to keep anything down that morning. They ate in silence as the last light faded and a blanket of brilliant stars emerged in the ink-black sky. He handed her a plate with a portion of the simple meal. It was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. When she had finished, he took her plate without a word and cleaned it in the creek along with his own. The silence began to feel less like a void and more like a space for her to breathe. Still, the questions churned in her mind, a frantic, desperate current beneath the surface of her exhaustion. Finally, she found her voice again, though it came out as a wavering thread of sound. "Why?" He was tending to the fire, poking the logs with a stick. He didn't look at her. "Why what? Why did you do that?" "Pay that much money." She clutched the receipt still tucked in her dress pocket. Its crinkled paper was the only tangible proof that the afternoon had been real. "You don't know me." He set the stick down and finally turned his head, his face illuminated by the flickering firelight. His features were stark, his expression serious. "I know men like Mayor Croft," he said, his voice quiet. "I know what they call justice. It has a bad taste." It wasn't the answer she expected. She had braced herself for a discussion of terms, of what he expected from her. Instead, he spoke of principle. But the contract, a year of labor. He looked at her directly then, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something other than stoicism in his eyes. It looked like a deep, weary anger, not directed at her, but at the world that had put her on that platform. "The paper is for them," he said, gesturing vaguely in the direction of the town. "It is their language. It satisfies their laws." He paused, choosing his words with care. "You are not my servant, Miss Vance. I did not buy a person. I bought a desk. And I paid for the privilege of seeing the look on that mayor's face when his power became worth less than a piece of gold." Alara stared at him, her mind struggling to process his words. He was negating the very foundation of the day's horror. He was telling her she was free. The concept was so foreign, so sudden, that it felt like a trick. What do you want from me, then?" she asked, her voice trembling. He stood up and walked over to his supply wagon. After a moment, he returned, carrying a large, heavy object wrapped in canvas. He set it down on the ground near her in the circle of firelight. With a gentle pull, he unwrapped it. It was her desk. It must have been loaded onto the back of the wagon while she was waiting. It looked absurd and yet magnificent sitting there in the dirt and firelight, its polished cherry wood glowing like a banked ember. It was the symbol of her shame, the centerpiece of her humiliation. "This is yours," Chayton said simply. "I'm a horse trader. I have no use for a teacher's desk." He looked at her, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. "You owe me nothing. You're free to go wherever you wish. When we reach the trading post at Two Forks in a few days, you can take the stagecoach east. I will give you the fare." Alara looked from his face to the desk and back again. The sheer, unadorned decency of his offer was more overwhelming than the cruelty she had faced that morning. Tears welled in her eyes again, but these were not tears of fear or shame. They were tears of profound, shattering relief. "But until then," he continued, his voice practical again, pulling her back from the edge of emotion, "you are a guest in my camp. There's food. There's water. It is safe here." He gestured to the small tent. You can have the tent. I will sleep by the fire." He turned away then, as if the conversation was closed, and began to lay out his own bedroll on the far side of the fire, giving her privacy and space. Alara sat on the rock, the warmth of the fire on her face, the cool night air at her back. She looked at her desk, sitting solid and real under a canopy of a million stars. The man on the other side of the fire had not just bought her freedom. He had, in his own quiet, deliberate way, begun to give her back her humanity. And in the vast, silent wilderness, surrounded by the horses and the whispering cottonwoods, she felt a sense of safety she hadn't known in months. She was still a disgraced woman, pregnant and alone, but she was no longer property. For tonight, that was more than enough. The next few days settled into a quiet, unspoken rhythm. Chayton was a man of routine and purpose. He rose before the sun, his movements quiet so as not to wake her. He would tend to the horses, his murmuring voice a low, soothing sound as he groomed them and checked their hooves. By the time Alara emerged from the tent, blinking in the pale morning light, a fire would be going and coffee would be brewing. He never demanded anything of her. He simply went about his work, and she, in turn, began to find ways to contribute. It started small. She took over the washing of the tin plates and cups after their meals. She learned to grind the coffee beans. When she saw him mending a tear in a saddle blanket with clumsy, thick stitches, she tentatively offered to do it. She had always been skilled with a needle. He handed it over without hesitation, along with a small leather pouch containing needles and thread. She sat on her rock by the fire, the blanket across her lap, her fingers moving with a forgotten familiarity. The small, neat stitches were a comfort, a piece of her old life reasserting itself. When she was finished, the mend was almost invisible. She handed it back to him. He examined her work, his dark eyes tracing the line of her stitching. He grunted, a sound of gruff approval that felt more gratifying than a torrent of praise. The desk remained a silent, surreal presence in their camp. They loaded it carefully onto the wagon each morning and unloaded it each evening. It was a shared, unspoken responsibility. For Alara, it was becoming less a symbol of her shame and more a marker of her rescue, a tangible piece of her identity that this strange, quiet man had salvaged from the wreckage. One evening, as the sun set, she found herself running a hand over its smooth surface. She opened the small central drawer. Inside, just as she had left it, was a slim volume of poetry by Mr. Whitman and a half-finished letter to her sister in Ohio, a letter she'd never had the courage to finish or send. Seeing them felt like finding lost pieces of herself. Later that night, as they sat by the fire, a profound stillness settled between them. The horses shifted and snorted softly in the darkness. The creek murmured its endless song. On impulse, Alara retrieved the book of poetry from a desk. "Would you?" she began, her voice hesitant. "Would you mind if I read aloud? It helps to settle my thoughts." Chayton was sharpening a knife on a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone a steady counterpoint to the crackle of the fire. He glanced up, his expression neutral. "The air is free." It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no. Taking it as permission, she opened the book. She chose a poem she knew well, one about the open road. Her voice, at first thin and reedy, grew stronger as she read, the familiar cadence of the words a balm to her frayed nerves. She spoke of vast landscapes, of the sky, of the simple dignity of existence. When she finished, the silence that followed was different. It was filled with the echoes of the words. Chayton had stopped sharpening his knife. He was staring into the fire, his face thoughtful. "He understands the land," he said quietly, after a long moment. That man who wrote the words. It was the most he had said on any subject that wasn't purely practical. A small bridge had been built between them, woven from poetry and firelight. From then on, she read to him most evenings. He never asked her to, but he always listened, his quiet attention a form of conversation in itself. In turn, he began to share parts of his world with her. He taught her the names of the plants they passed: yarrow for staunching blood, sage for purification. He showed her how to read the tracks of deer, and coyote in the dust. He spoke of his horses not as livestock, but as individuals, each with its own spirit and temperament. He taught her their Lakota names: Wanblee, the eagle-like stallion he rode; Anpo, the gentle mare she rode, whose name meant dawn. She learned to see the world through his eyes, a landscape not empty, but full of meaning, life, and stories. She saw his deep connection to it all, a reverence that the people of Redemption Gulch, with their fences and their rigid doctrines, could never comprehend. One afternoon, as they made camp, a sudden, violent thunderstorm rolled in. The sky turned a bruised, greenish-black, and the wind howled through the coulee. Rain came down in blinding sheets. They huddled in the small tent, the canvas straining against the gale. A crack of lightning split the sky, followed by a deafening clap of thunder. Alara flinched violently, a small cry escaping her lips. Chayton, who had been sitting impassively on the far side of the tent, shifted closer. He didn't touch her, but his presence was a solid, calming anchor in the storm. "The Thunder Beings are restless," he said, his voice a low rumble that was somehow comforting against the roar outside. "But they will pass. They always do." She looked at him, her fear momentarily forgotten. "The Thunder Beings?" He nodded. "They are powerful spirits. They bring the rain that gives life, but their power can also be destructive. They demand respect." She listened as he spoke, not of meteorology or atmosphere pressure, but of a world alive with spirits and ancient power. He spoke of the sky as a living entity, of the rain as a gift. He was giving her a small piece of his soul, a glimpse into the beliefs that shaped the quiet strength she saw in him every day. The storm passed as quickly as it had come, leaving the air clean and smelling of wet earth and sage. As the sun broke through the clouds, a magnificent double rainbow arched across the sky. Alara stepped out of the tent and gasped. Chayton came to stand beside her. They looked at it together, this breathtaking, ephemeral spectacle. In that moment, sharing the silence and the beauty, Alara felt a profound shift within her. The fear and shame that had been her constant companions were receding, replaced by a tentative, fragile sense of peace. She was beginning to feel not just safe, but home. This fragile peace was shattered 2 days later. They were less than a day's ride from Two Forks. Chayton had gone ahead to scout the trail, leaving Alara to watch the camp and the horses. She was sitting at her desk, which they'd set up under a cottonwood tree, trying once more to write the letter to her sister. She wanted to tell her she was safe, that she had met a good man, but the words were difficult to form. How could she explain the complexities of her situation? The sound of approaching riders made her look up, her heart lurching with a familiar dread. It wasn't Chayton. It was 3 men from Redemption Gulch. In the lead, his face a thundercloud of self-importance, was Mayor Silas Croft. Beside him rode the sour-faced farmer, Griggs, and another town councilman. Well, Croft sneered, reining in his horse and looking down at her. His eyes swept over the camp, taking in the scene. The neat fire pit, the grazing horses, and Alara, sitting at her desk as if she were in a schoolroom. "Playing house, are we?" Alara rose slowly, her hand instinctively going to her belly. "What do you want, Mayor?" "Just check in on town property," Griggs grumbled, spitting a stream of brown juice near her feet. "The contract says a year's labor. This don't look like labor." "The contract was fulfilled the moment I paid you," a calm voice said from behind them. Croft and his men spun around. Chayton was there, astride his black stallion, appearing as if from the earth itself. He must have seen them from the ridge and circled back. His face was impassive, but there was a dangerous stillness in his posture. "Now, see here," Croft blustered, trying to regain his footing. "We have concerns. It ain't proper, a woman like you, in her condition, out here alone with him." He said the word with a venomous contempt that made Alara's blood run cold. "She is not alone," Chayton stated, dismounting and walking to stand between Alara and the intruders. "She is under my protection." "Protection?" Croft laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "That's what you call it? The town council has discussed it. We find this arrangement unsuitable. It's a moral hazard. We've decided to nullify the contract. For her own good, of course. We'll be taking her back. Griggs here has generously offered to see to her indenture properly. And the child will be placed with a good, God-fearing family. The world tilted. Alara felt the air leave her lungs. They were going to take her baby. The fear she felt was no longer a dull ache. It was a blade twisting in her gut. This was her worst nightmare made real. All the fragile peace she had built over the last week crumbled to dust. She looked at Chayton. His face had become a mask of stone, but his eyes were blazing. He knew, as she did, that their flimsy receipt would mean nothing against the full weight of the town's hypocritical authority. The law they had used to their advantage could now be twisted against them. The hope he had given her was about to be ripped away, and she would be dragged back into the darkness. The wilderness that had become her sanctuary was about to become the scene of her capture. Alara's breath hitched, a strangled sob caught in her throat. Croft's words echoed in the clean air, poisoning it. The child will be placed. The casual cruelty of it, the absolute certainty in his voice, sent a tremor of pure terror through her. This wasn't about morality. It was about power. It was about Croft reasserting his control, punishing her for escaping, and punishing Chayton for defying him. She felt Chayton shift beside her, a subtle realignment of his weight. It was the stance of a man preparing for a fight. But she knew a physical confrontation would be disastrous. It would only prove their narrative, that he was a savage and she was a woman in his thrall. They would be overwhelmed by numbers and so-called law. It was in that moment of despair that something inside Alara broke. Not in surrender, but in a surge of desperate, maternal fury. They would not take her child. She had been passive for too long, a victim of circumstance, of betrayal, of judgment. She had accepted her fate on that auction block. But Chayton had shown her a different path. He had treated her with a quiet dignity that she had forgotten she deserved. He had given her a space to heal, and in that space, a seed of defiance had taken root. "No," she said. The word was quiet, but it cut through the tension like a blade. All four men looked at her. She took a step forward, moving to stand beside Chayton, not behind him. Her fear was still there, a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but it was now overlaid with a white-hot resolve. She looked directly at Silas Croft, meeting his gaze for the first time without flinching. "You will not take my child," she repeated, her voice gaining strength. "You have no right." Croft's face purpled with indignation. "Right? I am the mayor of Redemption Gulch. I represent the moral authority of this community. You, madam, forfeited your rights when you chose a life of sin. The life I chose was to love a man who lied to me." She shot back, her voice shaking but clear. "My sin was trust. What is yours, Mayor? Greed? Pride? The joy of tormenting a woman you have already broken." The directness of the accusation stunned him into momentary silence. The councilman shifted uneasily in his saddle. Griggs just scowled. Chayton remained silent, watching, letting her claim this ground for herself. He was her shield, but he was letting her be her own sword. "This is not a debate," Croft finally sputtered, his authority challenged in a way he hadn't anticipated. "We have a decree from the town council. It's legal." "So is this," Chayton said, his voice as cold and hard as river stone. He reached into his shirt and pulled out the folded receipt. He held it up. "A contract, paid in full. You cannot nullify a completed sale. We can and we will." Croft insisted, on grounds of moral endangerment. It was a standoff, their flimsy decree against his paid receipt, her word against theirs. In the end, Alara knew their power would win. They would simply take her. Desperation clawed at her. There had to be another way, a legal move they couldn't counter. Her mind raced, sifting through the wreckage of her old life, searching for a tool, a weapon. The law. They hid behind the law. What law was stronger than a town decree? What contract superseded an indenture? And then, like a lightning flash in the storm of her panic, the answer came to her. It was radical, terrifying, and in its own way, utterly logical. Her eyes met Chayton's. In that shared gaze, a universe of unspoken understanding passed. She saw his resolve to protect her at any cost. He saw the dawning of a desperate plan in her eyes. It was a gamble of the highest order, one that would irrevocably bind their lives together, not for a year, but for good. She took a deep breath, the clean, sage-scented air filling her lungs, giving her courage. She turned back to Croft, her chin held high. "You are mistaken, Mayor," she said, her voice ringing with a newfound, unshakable authority. "You cannot enforce an indenture contract on a married woman, and you have no claim on a child born within a legal marriage." A thick, profound silence fell over the coulee. Croft's jaw went slack. Griggs looked utterly baffled. Even the horses seemed to hold their breath. "Marriage," Croft finally choked out, looking from her to the stoic Lakota man beside her. "You're married?" To him, the incredulity and disgust in his voice were palpable. Alara didn't hesitate. She looked at Chayton, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. It was a plea, a question, and a declaration all in one. He held her gaze, his dark eyes searching hers. He saw no fear there now, only a fierce, protective fire. He saw a woman who had found her strength. He gave a single, slow nod. It was all the answer she needed. "Yes," Alara said, turning back to face her tormentors. She reached out, and her hand found Chayton's. His fingers closed around hers, his grip warm and strong. The contact sent a jolt of pure, solidifying truth through her. "We were married 2 days ago by a traveling minister, under the eyes of God and the laws of this territory." It was a lie, a beautiful, audacious, world-altering lie. But as she stood there, her hand in his, a united front against the ugliness of their world, it felt more true than anything Silas Croft had ever said. Croft stared at their joined hands, his face a mess of conflicting emotions. He was a bully, but he was also a petty bureaucrat who revered the letter of the law, especially when it was inconvenient for others. A marriage certificate, if it existed, would trump his town council decree. It was a legal fortress he could not breach. "I don't believe you," he blustered, but the conviction had gone out of his voice. "I want to see the certificate." Chayton spoke then, his voice laced with quiet menace. "Our lives are not for your inspection, Croft. The law is satisfied. You're trespassing. Leave now." He took a step forward, releasing Alara's hand. His body was coiled, radiating an aura of such potent danger that Griggs' horse shied back. Chayton was a man of peace, but Alara knew, with absolute certainty, that he was also a man capable of profound violence if pushed too far. He was protecting his wife. He was protecting his child. Croft saw it too. He saw the lie in their story, but he also saw the truth in their stand. He saw that he had pushed them to a point where they would not break, but would fight back with a power he couldn't control. To call their bluff would be to risk a confrontation he knew, instinctively, he would lose. Beaten, not by force, but by a cleverness and unity he hadn't expected, he tugged viciously on his reins. "This isn't over," he spat, but it was an empty threat. "Yes," Chayton said softly. "It is." Without another word, Croft wheeled his horse around and spurred it back toward the trail, his two companions scrambling to follow. They watched them go, their figures shrinking against the vast landscape until they were gone, swallowed by the wilderness that had become Alara and Chayton's refuge. The silence they left behind was vast and ringing. The immediate danger had passed, but the echo of their lie, their monumental, life-altering declaration, hung between them. Alara's legs suddenly felt weak. She sank onto the rock by the fire pit, her whole body trembling with the aftermath of the confrontation. Chayton came to her. He knelt before her, his expression unreadable in the afternoon light. Their hands, which had been joined in a public statement of unity, now felt shy and uncertain. "You were brave," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "I was desperate," she whispered, looking down at her hands, which were clenched in her lap. "I am sorry. I had no right to say that, to put you in that position." He reached out, his calloused fingers gently covering her clenched fists. "You had every right," he said. "He was going to take your son." He paused, and his thumb brushed against her knuckles. "Our son." Alara's head snapped up, her eyes wide. The way he said it, "our son," held no pretense. It was a simple statement of fact, a declaration of a truth that went deeper than any lie they had told. He was no longer just a protector. He had claimed her and her child as his own. "The town of Two Forks is a day's ride," he continued, his voice steady, anchoring her. "There's a courthouse there, a judge." It wasn't a question. It was a plan. He was going to turn their lie into the truth. He was offering her not just a temporary shield, but a permanent sanctuary. He was offering her his name, his protection, his life. Tears streamed down her face, but for the first time, they were tears of unadulterated joy. She looked at this quiet, honorable man, this outsider who had seen her worth when she had been priced at nothing. He had outsmarted a crowd, faced down a mayor, and now he was offering to build a life with her, founded on a desperate untruth that had revealed the truest parts of their hearts. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Ching." He nodded, a slow, gentle smile finally touching the corners of his mouth. He squeezed her hands once, a gesture of profound, unspoken commitment. He had bought her desk in an auction, but in the crucible of defiance and desperation, they had just forged a family. The next day, they rode into Two Forks not as a rescuer and a refugee, but as a couple. The town was larger and rougher than Redemption Gulch, a bustling hub of trappers, traders, and cowboys. But here, their pairing drew little more than a passing glance. The wildness of the frontier bred a certain tolerance for the unconventional. Chayton found the courthouse, a small, clapboard building that smelled of stale paper and cheap cigars. The judge was a wiry old man with spectacles perched on the end of his nose and an air of weary pragmatism. He looked them over, his eyes lingering on Alara's belly, then on Chayton's stoic, brown face. "You want to get married," he stated, his tone flat. "Yes, sir," Chayton said. The judge sighed, dipping his pen in an inkwell. "Name?" "Chayton," he answered. He had no surname he offered to the white man's world. "And you, miss?" the judge asked, looking at Alara. "Alara Vance." The judge scribbled on the certificate. He asked them their ages and places of birth, his pen scratching across the paper. When the document was filled out, he motioned for them to sign. Alara's hand trembled as she wrote her name. Then Chayton took the pen. He did not write a name. Instead, with a steady hand, he drew a single, elegant symbol, a stylized falcon in flight. It was his mark, his true name. The judge looked at the symbol, raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. He stamped the document with a heavy, official seal. "All right, then. By the authority vested in me by the territory, I pronounce you man and wife. That'll be $2. Chayton paid him, took the certificate, and folded it carefully. And just like that, it was done. The lie was now the law. They stepped out of the courthouse and into the bright sunlight, a married couple. A profound sense of peace settled over Alara. The fear that had been her shadow for so long had finally vanished, burned away by the simple, legal fact of this union. Chayton did not take her to the stagecoach office. Instead, he led her to the land agent. He spread a map on the counter, and, after a long, quiet negotiation with the agent, he used the remainder of his horse-trading profits to purchase a deed. It was for 160 acres of land, a day's ride from Two Forks, in a valley with a creek running through it, not unlike the coulee where they had first found refuge. They spent the next few days in town, stocking up on supplies, sacks of flour and beans, tools, seeds for a garden, and 2 milk cows. He sold the flashiest of his horses, keeping only the stallion, Wanblee, and the gentle mare, Ampo. The last thing they loaded onto their wagon was the cherrywood desk. When they finally rode out of Two Forks, they traveled not toward the east, but west, deeper into the frontier, toward their own piece of land. As they traveled, the silence between them was no longer a space of healing, but one of comfortable companionship. They spoke of the land, of the cabin they would build, of the garden she would plant. They found their land nestled in a valley that seemed blessed by the sun. The creek was clear and cold, and the soil was rich and dark. They worked side by side, a partnership forged in action, not words. He felled the trees and hewed the logs for their cabin. She cooked their meals, tended the small vegetable patch she started immediately, and planned the layout of their home. He was a man of immense practical skill, and she a woman of quiet, organizational strength. They fit together like two pieces of a puzzle that had been waiting for each other. The cabin rose slowly but steadily, a testament to their shared labor. One evening, after a long day of work, they sat before their half-finished home, watching the sunset paint the sky. The cherrywood desk sat nearby, placed in the spot where the main window would be. Alara was rubbing her swollen belly, feeling the strong, steady kicks of her child. Chayton came and sat beside her, handing her a cup of tea. He looked at the cabin, then at her, his expression warm with a deep, quiet contentment. "It is a good place," he said. "It's a perfect place," she answered, her voice soft. She leaned her head against his shoulder, a gesture that felt as natural as breathing. He put his arm around her, holding her close. They sat there in the fading light, a man who had traded horses for a home, and a woman who had been auctioned into a new life. He had not just bought her desk, he had bought her a future, and she, in her desperation, had claimed a husband who had turned out to be the truest man she had ever known. Looking out at the vast, beautiful, and empty land that was now theirs, they were not an outcast Lakota trader and a disgraced teacher. They were simply a family, at the beginning of everything, their life built not on a foundation of law or lies, but on a single, extraordinary act of compassion in a dusty town square. He watched her smile, her face illuminated by the last rays of the sun, and knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that the $20 gold piece had been the best trade he had ever made. Her true worth was finally seen. What does true value in a person mean to you? Tell us below. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more.